Hello everyone. So for today's card, I'm using an image by Penny Black. They call this Sparkler, which I don't understand because it's a poinsettia, but that's what it's called. I got this stamp not too long ago and I wanted to use it for watercoloring. I purposely got this image because I wanted to watercolor it and play around. And this is the first time in I can't even remember how long that I actually got to sit down and just play. So I took a piece of Tim Holtz Distress or Ranger Distress watercolor cardstock. It's a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I stamped on the textured side this time just to try again something different. I always stamp on the smooth side and color on the smooth side, so I wanted to see if the textured side would do something different. And I used Black Soot Distress ink, which, as you guys saw, I stamped off 2 or 3 times before stamping onto the watercolor paper. And I actually should have stamped it off even yet another time. That was something else I wanted to experiment with, is trying to get that whole almost no line, more realistic watercoloring going. This is something I've never really done before. I've seen other people do it and it just looks absolutely gorgeous. Like, it looks like they freehand colored this image and it's just so pretty and you can't see the lines. This didn't work out as well because I didn't stamp it off enough times. I definitely should have stamped off at least 1, if not 2 more times, because you should barely be able to see the outline. And here you can see it quite well. So, and being distress ink, since it reacts with water, it'll kind of fade even more into your watercolor, but I stamped it a little too dark. So in the end, you still kind of see it, which is fine. It's just something to know for next time. So like I said, though, this whole thing was kind of an experiment on my part. I was really just playing around and just decided to turn the camera on while I did it, which left me with a ton of video footage to edit down into a decent sized video. But I'm using my White Nights watercolor palette for this. And these are really good watercolors. I've shown them in a couple other videos. I've never done like a specific review of them or anything. They're not super easy to come by. I know I linked to them. You can get them on Amazon, so somewhat easy. I think Dick Blick carries them as well. Anywhere that carries more artist supplies, like these aren't like a, stamping watercolor type thing. These are gorgeous watercolors. Like, I really need to practice with them more because they're so super saturated and I'm just not used to that. I like to color full on solid color, and me and watercolor just, it's a hit and a miss depending on what I'm using. And these I definitely need to practice with because I've only used them a few times. But basically all I was doing was wetting the petals with a damp brush, and I worked with the top layer, like the smaller petals first, watercolored them all in, and then let them dry, and then worked on the larger petals below. You don't want to work wet on wet, like next to anything, because they'll bleed into each other. So this image was really good for that because the petals are all separated. So you can kind of do each layer, let it dry, go on to the next layer, and things aren't going to bleed into each other. I mixed my first layer with a bit of green there on the palette. That just kind of mutes, like green mutes red. Anything on the opposite side of the color spectrum will mute its color. These are all things I know, but it's not things I generally practice. So yeah, this whole thing was just one big experiment for me. So I was just literally going back and forth, letting each layer dry and then adding color. And I ended up adding a ton of color. Like, I don't know when to stop. I have a hard time with watercolor, when you're supposed to more sit back and let things kind of do their own thing, like let the water do the work, let the colors go in. I have a really hard time with that. Like, you can see, I pretty much use my paintbrush as a marker and just color right on the image. So I just kept adding color, even like adding it straight from the watercolor cake there, just picking it up and coloring it on like a marker until I was like somewhat happy with it. Really, in the end, I kind of hated how all this whole thing looked. I thought I did a horrible job, but I've said this before as well in videos. No matter what, finish it to the end, walk away from it for a while, a day, a week, whatever, set it aside, walk away from it, go do something else, come back to it. And that's what I did with this once I was done. I really was unhappy with it. I was like, oh, I went overboard. I didn't like it. But I went off, had lunch. Caitlin was still napping. That's the only reason why I had time to do this. She was napping, and I had a little bit of free time. And then, yeah, I wasn't happy with it. I walked off, went and had lunch, did a few different things, came back to it and realized I didn't hate it quite as much. I still didn't like it in the end, but I didn't hate it and think it was awful. So I finished it into a card, as you guys are going to see. And yeah, it's just, it was fun to be able to just sit and play. And now if I get, you know, when I get a chance to play again, I'll try something different. So I really just went back and forth with different colors. I used some yellows to do the center of the poinsettia and then some browns to do the very center. And then I kind of mixed some greens and yellows to do the big leaf here and just kind of darkened it up. And again, you just layered the colors. Layered too many colors as always. But in the end, it was fine. Like it is definitely, and watercolor is definitely one of those things that always looks different when it dries. And then for the background, I actually used my the pumice stone distress marker. I've seen other people do that, and I really like that idea. Distress markers I'm more comfortable with. What I should have done though was used a much larger brush. This brush is way too small to do a background. Like I wanted things to be a little more blended, a little smoother, but when you're working with such a small brush, it's kind of hard to do that because it can't hold enough water. But again, when I walked away from it and came back to it, I was okay with it. I was kind of like, oh, this looks like just a muddy mess, but it's fine. And as it dries, of course, it gets a little bit lighter. It's not so bad. But note for next time is to use a large brush. So I just kept picking up the marker off of an acrylic block there, so it was not quite as harsh as it would have been if you just colored the marker and then tried to move the color. So yeah, let it dry completely, and then decided I had to add some splatters to it because that usually, you know, just kind of improves it. So I've got this old towel that I just lay out now that covers as much of my workspace as possible because no matter what you do, splatters go everywhere. I've had them all over the place. So I loaded up my brush with the red and splattered it, and then also loaded it up with some of the kind of goldy yellow color, the same color as the center there, and splattered that as well. And then let it dry fully, and then to make everything better, just add some Wink of Stella. So I had a gold to the center, just right over the yellow areas. So it just deepened it and added some nice gold shimmer. And then I added some brown Wink of Stella to the very center. And then I added a bit of red to the petals. I was really sparing with the red because going over watercolor with these will reactivate watercolor, obviously being a wet medium. So I just took the red Wink of Stella and went just along like the center lines of the petals and then brushed a little bit just in the very, very middle of each petal. And it just adds that little extra bit of shimmer without being like in your face crazy and covering up like everything. Like Wink of Stella can kind of erase mistakes in a way, just cover it with shimmer and you can't tell. But you don't want to add too much because then it just looks silly. So just a light coating of that. And then I wanted to trim this down a bit because I didn't want it to be like the full card front. So like I said, it was originally 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I just basically trimmed off 1/8 of an inch off of each side of this panel. So I love this Fiskars paper trimmer. I can't believe I waited so long to finally just bite the bullet and get it, even though it's not that expensive. But I love that little wire where the cutting line is. It just, so nice to be able to see that. And this thing, I have not had any problems yet. I'm still using the same blade that it came with. I haven't found that they run out at all or like go dull faster, but those are the titanium blades. They're supposed to last longer and they better because they're freaking expensive. So anywho, for the sentiments, I wasn't sure which ones to use. I have 2 stamp sets, my Happy Holidays and my Christmas Blessings set, which I haven't even had a chance to use yet. I will link to those with the supplies below, but they've got a whole bunch of, you know, big scripty fonts and then a bunch of little coordinating sentiments. And I hummed and hawed over what to use and finally decided on this Rejoice sentiment, and this one's from the Happy Holidays set. So I trimmed it out with my Tim Holtz scissors, which are wonderful for cutting out rubber stamps, like absolutely wonderful. It's like butter, the way those things cut. And then on the bottom corner, I coated really, really well with my EK Success powder tool and then poured the gold embossing powder over that just to make sure it wasn't going to cling to anything because, you know, you got all this work of watercoloring and I was a little nervous about like stamping over it. I was like, oh, it'll be just my luck. I'm going to mess it up. But using a stamp positioner really helps because it's holding the cardstock kind of flatter because that's part of it too. It's warped from the watercoloring. So being able to use a stamp positioner kind of held the cardstock in place. And then I just inked up the stamp with Versamark ink and got that stamped really well on there. And then coated it with the gold embossing powder. Again, if I could redo this, I should have just used regular gold embossing powder because it would have given a more raised look, which was what I was going for. This Ranger Detail Gold is perfect for really fine details and fine lines. And if you want a flatter look, But this sentiment is so much bigger that it would have worked perfectly with just a normal gold embossing powder. So again, live and learn. Next time I will use just a regular embossing powder to get the look I want. So I wanted to make this stand out a bit more then. So I just took that same pumice stone distress marker and scribbled it onto the acrylic block and picking it up with the paintbrush and just really lightly painting on a shadow around the embossed sentiment just to give it that little extra something. Again, totally kind of unnecessary, but just experimenting with everything. So for the inside of the card, it's standard A2 size card, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm using more sentiments from the Happy Holidays set. So I inked up the greetings stamp with Memento's Ladybug red ink and stamp positioner again, so I get everything stamped straight. I stamped the greetings first, and then there's a Merry Christmas stamp in that set, and I inked up just the Christmas with Memento Tuxedo Black ink. I just like that one because I've got the little teardrop shape pads for that, so it's perfect when inking up like just certain parts of stamps or smaller stamps. So stamp the Christmas and then use the positioner again to finish off the last little part of the sentiment, again with the Tuxedo Black ink. And that finished off the inside. So the outside, I used a ton of foam tape on this watercolor piece so that it would adhere flat to the card because it wasn't super warped, but warped enough. So lots of foam tape and popped it on my card, and that's all there was to it. So all the info will be in the description box below with the links to the supplies and links to my blog post. So check that out if you are interested. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye!